We kicked off this collection message last week called Stretched. If you missed any of it, I would highly encourage you to jump on YouTube and check it out. Last week, we had such a fantastic Sunday last week. I truly enjoyed last week, and there was a lot of good stuff. Jump online and catch up if you weren't here. I'm not going to say that you missed the greatest cake pops in the history of time, but I'm not going to say that you didn't. We had cake pops last week. Not something that most pastors get to say on a Sunday, but we had cake pops last Sunday. They were remarkable as we celebrated 30 years as a Timberlake organization together. So those are not on the YouTube video. You cannot get those back, but check out last week. It was a good Sunday, and never miss again. I'm glad that you're here. First service was packed because the Seahawks are playing right now. People are like, we got to get church out of the way. Russell's throwing touchdowns already. I went long just to make sure that I stuck it to the first service crowd. You think you're pulling on me? Nope. What else? Nothing. All right, so we're in this series called Stretch, and the idea behind this is based on this one verse that Paul writes to the early church in Corinth, where he's in the middle of his persecution, and him and the apostles are going through this life-fearing persecution, and he writes this to the church. He says, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." Here's what it comes down to. Paul is fighting for his life in his persecution. His persecution looks different than our persecution. He was fighting for his physical life, and while we don't fight for our physical lives, we fight for our emotional lives, our mental lives, and we face these uphill battles at all times. And the idea behind this series is that so much in life, we get stretched. We get stressed. We take on anxiety and frustration and emotional debt. And so all of us, we kind of started out the same way. I started thinking about childhood this past week, and I want to travel back to childhood for a minute, and you can do this in your own seat. Think back to your childhood. Did anybody have a good childhood? Did anybody enjoy their childhood? In first service, I think 3 people said yes, and so I went a completely different direction with service. No, childhood is terrible. Here's the thing about childhood. We all had different childhoods, right? Different location, different family dynamic, different financial status, different family dynamics, but we all started out in a similar way as children. I was watching this Netflix show this week, maybe you've heard of it. It's called The Toys That Made Us. Has anybody seen that? No Netflix users? Yeah, I just read the Bible all the time. So I was watching this Netflix documentary. It's called The Toys That Made Us, right? And if you're an 80s kid, you should watch this show. If you're not an 80s kid, you should watch this show. It's all about the toys that made us. And I spent 45 minutes learning the deep history of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles this week. And I loved every single minute of it, right? All the way to present, they still exist. And then it's a documentary series, so each episode is a different toy. Very, very fascinating stuff. You should watch it. When I was a kid, life was easy. All I cared about was Ninja Turtles, right? Ninja Turtles and X-Men. Anybody into the X-Men? Did anybody get Disney Plus in the last couple weeks? Did you happen to notice that the original X-Men series is on Disney Plus? I'm also watching that. I swear I'm a grown-up. Life as a child was a lot easier, right? And for me, it's funny because I'll talk to my parents, and what seemed like a very, very easy life for me was not always necessarily the case. You know, our parents kind of shield us from a lot of things. And over the years, as I get older, my parents release more information about how terrible childhood was for me. But for the most part, it was good. I remember I used to get a $5 allowance. Any allowance, people? I used to get $5 a week, and it's great because as an adult, I found out as a child we didn't have any money, but my parents gave me $5 a week, and I was awesome at allowance. every week I'd get this $5 and I would save it. And I would save it up to buy basketball jerseys. And I was always buying Orlando Magic jerseys. Like every Shaquille O'Neal jersey in the world was in my drawer. They're fantastic. And I would save my $5. They were $40 and I would save up for them. One time I saved up and I bought my own basketball hoop, right? Like I had dreams. I had aspirations, right? Eventually I realized that $5 would buy a lot of candy, and the candy negated my dreams, along with my skill set and my height. But I had dreams, right? Like childhood was a lot different. We didn't care about what we care about now. The things that we cared about as a child are not what we care about now, and the things that we care about now, we didn't care about as a child. Tuesday morning, I wake up, and the first thing that Shayna says to me, she starts telling me this story about something that happened in our neighborhood the night before with, teenagers. And, teens wreaking havoc in our neighborhood. And we're a part of this Facebook group online on Facebook, and it's this neighborhood watch group. And I was reading through it the night before, and my thought reading through it was if somebody was reading this completely oblivious to where we live, that this is, in fact, Kelso, Washington, they would think this is inner city Detroit. By the way that these moms talk on this Facebook group, right? The teenagers, they are ruining all of it. That's what this Facebook group, teenagers and cats, right? Cats, and I've told you about the cats. There are cats everywhere, teenagers and cats, right? And teenagers, I love you, teenagers. But the moms don't. I came home last night very, very late. I had a very late night last night. And I'm driving down my street, and I'm trying to turn in my driveway, but I couldn't turn in my driveway because there were teenagers standing in it. And I'm like, go home and go to sleep, right? Where are the moms? They're angry on Facebook, but they're asleep right now. I'm just joking. Teens, I love you. Hey, did you guys know that we're starting? I can announce this is my thing. I run the show. Can I announce this? Next month, January, we're starting a every week youth program. Right? Oh man, I'll tell you what. Middle section loves it. Every Wednesday night, it's gonna be stinking awesome. I love it. Anyway, so the world around us is getting rough, right? Things are not the same now as they were when we were kids, whatever decade that falls in. Things are not the same as they were. As children, we walked tall with this confidence that everything would be fine. I had carte blanche of my town. I could do whatever I wanted, right? Ride your bike anywhere you wanted to go. There was nothing that could happen to me as a child negatively. My family was safe. My school was great. I didn't think otherwise because there was this built-in confidence inside of me. As children, we have this built-in confidence that everything is great. And then life kept progressing. And even in the last 10 years as a society and as a culture, I feel like we've almost fast-tracked. And things are kind of scary now, even outside of my mom's Facebook group, right? Things are kind of scary. And they've fast-tracked. And the built-in confidence that we used to have is no longer built in. Our confidence is manufactured in this thing called hope. Hope is where I place my confidence. Hope is someone or something that I look to as a source of stability. I can put my hope in my education. I can put my hope in my relationship. I can put my hope in my career. I can put my hope in my talents. The hard part is that so much of our stress and our anxiety comes because we're putting our hope in something that is unstable and it's faulty. Our confidence comes in things that we can look to as a source of stability, but our education and our relationships and our jobs and our talents are unstable things. And what we do is we partner them with these unrealistic expectations. And most of the time, we're completely oblivious that we have these unrealistic expectations. We expect our education and our relationships, in our careers, and our finances and our abilities and our talents to have stability in our life. Our problem is that rarely do we think about hope outside of the process of hopelessness. Until we are in the process of hopelessness, we don't consider hope. We sing songs like we just sang about living hope, and Jesus died on a cross but then was raised again. We have this living hope, and we can get excited about it on a Sunday morning when we're singing the song, but then we walk out and that's kind of the end of hope until we step into the process of hopelessness. And I call it a process because hopelessness is something that develops over time, and it's either defeated or it defeats, right? The question is, what do we do when the foundation that we have built our life on begins to crumble around us? When our foundation begins to collapse around us? When you're sitting in the middle of your collapse, and anxiety and stress and frustration and fear are at all-time highs? When the doctor gives the bad diagnosis, when your spouse decides to leave, when financial pressures are at all-time highs? My hope, my personal hope sits in Jesus because I've become so keenly aware that I have this incredible inability to pull myself out of hopelessness. I cannot pull myself out of my own hopelessness. The things I'm capable of doing, my job, my life, my relationships cannot pull me out of hopelessness. It's why Paul was so definitive in his explanation of strength in persecution. My expectations are not in relationships. My expectations are not in things that I achieve, because those are all momentary accomplishments. They're not things that carry me through. It's not my reputation. It's not my abilities. It's solely in a God who sustains. Psalm 33 says we put our hope in the Lord. We put our hope in the Lord. He is our help and our shield. In him our hearts rejoice, for we trust in his holy name. Let your unfailing love surround us, Lord, for our hope is in you alone. We are taught from day one to follow the rules. And if we follow the rules, if we go to the right schools, if we don't drink and we don't smoke and we save for retirement and we marry the right person, that everything's going to be okay, right? That we're safe, that we're protected. And they're great guidelines, but they actually don't protect us from things falling apart. I read this past week that 750,000 people file for bankruptcy every year. 750,000 people. That's insane. And not most, but a large portion of that number are people that followed the rules. But following the rules doesn't safeguard us from things falling apart. Hope doesn't mean that things are 100% all the time. It just means that we have something to stand on, to stand for, to believe in. Hope in God means that our battles and our struggles that we go through in life are not wasted. Hope says the things that I walk through can still be turned around through God's plan for our life. Hope in God means that my failures are not final. Let's go back to Paul. Paul is a perfect example of this. Paul is a perfect example of a Christ follower. He was disciplined. He read scripture. He prayed over and over and over and over again. He led people to Christ. Paul is still leading people to Christ. And yet, even through this perfect example of what a Christian should look like, Paul faced persecution and stress and anxiety and tragedy and difficulty. I have 4 thoughts this morning that you can jot down. And let's build some context, because context changes everything. Paul was under this constant persecution because at one point in his life he's killing Christians, and now all of a sudden he's preaching Jesus. He's living a life that's sold out for Christ, and the Jews didn't like that. If you've ever read scripture or thought about church in this way that maybe scripture is no longer relevant, I would counter and say scripture is the most relevant thing in the world. Here's why. We face the same things that Paul faced 2,000 years ago. We are in this world where maybe the players have changed, but the game is still the same. Where we live this life where there are these massive cultural divides. We know it. We talked even in the last 10 years, this almost fast track of our culture, of our society. There's this cultural divide in America. There's this cultural divide in our immediate world around us, and then globally. There are cultural divides. And the same thing was happening 2,000 years ago. The Jews and the non-Jews didn't cross those cultural divides. So Paul shows up and he begins to disrupt the system solely based on Jesus' disruption of the system. He simply furthered and pushed Jesus' disruption. And people didn't like it, and a lot of rumors began to start and circulate. And all of a sudden, Paul was preaching things city to city, but it was all getting very, very muddied up. Rumors were going around, and people were saying, well, Paul said this. Well, no, Paul didn't say that. And all these things, these wires are beginning to get crossed. And as a result of the wires getting crossed, these riots started breaking out. It's a weird thought, right? I mean, could you imagine one of you thinking that I said something last week and the other person being like, no, I don't think he said that. And then a riot starts, right? Like that's what's essentially happening in the life of Paul. So Paul shows up to Jerusalem, this riot starts, it breaks out, and Paul is arrested. Paul goes to prison. He's supposed to be in prison for a couple of days. He ended up being in prison for 2 years. And then he's sent to trial, and he has to go to Rome to stand trial. And they didn't travel by white school bus with chain on them. They traveled by boat. So Paul goes to the boat. It's November-ish, and the weather is very, very bad. So most of the boats have docked, and they're not sailing because of the bad weather. And Paul's boat decides to sail anyway. It says this next, 27. It says, when a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought they could make it. So they pulled up anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete. I talked about Crete a few weeks ago. But the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength called a northeaster burst across the island and blew us out to sea. The sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run before the gale. So they're blown out to sea because the sailors couldn't turn the boat back around, so the sailors committed to it. They gave up and let it run before the gale. See, we get stretched and we have to make a choice. We get stressed and we have to make a choice. We face anxiety and we have to make a choice. But my question is this: have you ever just committed to the storm? Said, you know what, I'm going to ride this out. We talked last week about controlling the situation. In that moment that we don't have the ability to control the situation. The sailors in this story could not control the situation. The thing is, we are well versed on the storm. We know what the storm looks like. We've walked through the storms. Maybe you're walking through the storm today. We understand the mess. We understand the trials and the things that we go through. The question is, are we riding them out the right way? Are we walking through them the right way? I've got 4 simple thoughts to apply to our mess. The first one is this: is stay put. Stay put. Verse 30 says, then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. They're pretending, right? They're pretending. And they start to let down the lifeboat. They're going to jump ship. They're going to take off. They're going to swim for safety, and they lower the lifeboats. I started thinking this week about tradition and things that we go through. We kind of talked about it a little bit earlier. I love holiday tradition, right? For me, I believe that we should always have green bean casserole at Thanksgiving. Right? Is everybody on board with that? I'm married into a family that does not believe that. But they make it for me anyway. Because we believe in tradition, right? I love tradition. For Christmas, we had this tradition that we would all go to Cincinnati at my grandma's house. And we wake up on Christmas morning, and the couch would be lined with stockings. They were jam-packed, and we'd start, flipping through everything, all the junk that goes into stockings. Because, who can afford to fill up 30 stockings, right? So you flip through all this nonsense. There's always, earrings and underwear and whatever else. Nothing you cared about. There was always a $2 bill, right? Did anybody get $2 bills as kids? No, just me? I'm loaded as a result. Give me a 5, Grandpa. We'd always get $2 bills. They were always in a special envelope because they were special, right? I don't know why. It's funny because I told first service this, and they all completely agreed with me. $2 bills are embarrassing, right? Like, nobody wants to use a $2 bill, right? Like your total is $1.99, and you pull out a 2. And you're just like, I'm sorry, right? It's the same thing with like the coin, the dollar coin. What are they called? Dollar coins? Silver dollar? Is that what they're called? I don't know. You know what I'm talking about. They're worth 100 pennies, but they're one coin. Like, they're embarrassing to use, right? Somebody's like, their offering is in your pocket right now, and you're all, nope. If you have any of those amounts of money today, put them in the offering. That'd be hilarious. There would always be a $2 bill in the stocking, and then, of course, in the very bottom, there would always be an orange, right? You guys had that? I learned this morning that was a depression thing. I just thought my grandma was weird. I never ate the orange. Somebody talked about how it was a privilege to have oranges in the depression. Do you guys know about that? We give our kids oranges all the time. They're privileged kids. But, so we'd always do our stockings, and then we'd go to our presents, and then we would have Christmas dinner, and then our family tradition is we'd all load into cars and we'd go see a movie, right? Like, we weren't the people that sat down and flipped through the Christmas story. You know, there's no Ebenezer Scrooge. We went to the movie. And so we'd go to the movie, and I remember in 1997, I was 13 years old, and we went and saw the movie Titanic on Christmas Day. Isn't it funny that the movie just has a stigma that you know to laugh when I say that? That was before the internet, so nobody knew you shouldn't take your 13-year-old son to see Titanic. And so we went to Titanic and had a very awkward Christmas. And I remember at the end of this movie, there's this scene, and it's etched into my brain. Everybody in the theater is crying. The boat is sinking. If you've never seen the movie or know history, spoiler alert. But the boat hits the iceberg, and it's going down, and the power goes out. Everybody in the theater is crying, right? I don't know if you saw it. I hope not. It's a terrible movie. But everybody's crying. I remember my cousin sitting next to me, and she's got tears rolling down her eyes. And as the boat is filling up with water, it begins to tip up. And I remember this scene where this guy either jumps or he falls off of the back of the boat. And as he's falling down, and it's just this real quick scene, I don't know that they meant it to be like this, but as he's falling down, he hits the rudder, and he begins spiraling out of control, right? And in that moment, my cousin, who had been sobbing, lets out the loudest burst of laughter in the entire theater. It was humiliating as a family. If we hadn't been embarrassed enough already up to that point, this kind of set the mark. And I tell you that to say this. I got in trouble in first service because they thought this was funny, and it wasn't supposed to be. But I started thinking about this. And we're in this mess, and we have this job sometimes to stay put. But sometimes we jump ship early, and we spiral out of control. It's a terrible thought. We don't want to acknowledge our mess. We'd rather abandon our mess. Our human condition says to hide our mess so that we can impress the people around us, so that we can carry our facade. In verse 31, it goes on, it says, "But Paul said to the commanding officers and the soldiers, 'You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard.' So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboats and let it drift away." Paul said, stay on the boat or everybody's going to die. Paul knew something. Obviously, Paul was close to Christ. Paul knew something in this moment. So many times in the middle of our storm, in the middle of our mess, in the middle of our trial, the best course of action is to just stay put. And of course, I'm not saying the guy in the movie should have done that. They were all doomed, right? Except Rose. A few years ago, I was serving at this church. And when we got to this church, it was a terrible situation, just like from the get-go. It just wasn't good. I struggled with my pastor, and I struggled with kind of the vision and where we were at in life. It just wasn't a good situation. And I remember I sat down and I started watching this message online. And I don't remember the message. It was incredibly random. I have no idea how I got to this message. I don't remember anything about it except one part. And I remember sitting down, I'm watching this message, and I'm kind of in the depth of despair at this time. Like, life was just not good. And I sat down and started watching this message, and in it, the pastor, he's preaching, and he comes to this point, and he says, don't go. And I didn't think anything of it, and then he said, don't go. And he repeats it again, he says, don't go. And I'm thinking, how'd I get here? Because I had been living this life thinking, I gotta go. Like, we thought from the beginning of this thing, we need to pack up and leave. But then I listened to this guy, and this guy says, don't go, don't go. So I applied it to my life, and we did not go. And we waited for God to release us from that season. The thing is that in that season, I had one of my kids, right? In that season, it provided me the opportunity to move to Castle Rock and pastor the best church in the world, right? Come on, we need more church pride. Things line up when we sit in our season and we wait it out. When we commit to the mess, when we commit to the storm, and we understand that potentially something is happening in the process, things line up and we see them come to fruition later in life. Don't abandon the process, because the process is shaping you, and it's shaping the things that are happening in your future, the things that are happening in your future that are being prepared for you. Here's the second thing. Take care of yourself. Take care of yourself. Paul goes on, he says, you have been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks. He said, please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair on your head will perish. That's a big promise. These guys are facing death, and Paul says, come eat lunch. Like, nothing's gonna happen to you. Have you ever been so worried about something that you didn't eat for 2 weeks? No. Right? Worried about something. The other day I walked by this oatmeal cream pie. And I was having a stressful week, and I thought to myself, I should stress eat that. And then I was like, no, I'll refrain. And I refrained. But what a promise, right? Paul shows up to these guys that are facing death. They are fearing for their life. And he says, you gotta take care of yourself, because we're all gonna be fine. Not a hair in our head is gonna be hurt. Here's what I know. We look at our storms, and we look at the things that we're facing. And in the end of all of them, we're going to be okay. We're going to be fine. The storm might last longer than we want it to. The storm might not end the way that we would choose it to end. But when our hope is founded and rooted and based in God's plan, we're going to be okay. Because God's plan doesn't end in turmoil. God doesn't script your plan or the will for your life and end it in turmoil. There is a reason for the storm. So when we're rooted in that, we can take confidence and security and faith that everything's gonna be okay. So we take care of ourselves. Maybe it's lunch. Maybe it's your mental stability. Maybe it's your sleep schedule. Maybe it's the cruciality of marriage counseling, whatever that looks like for your life. Take care of yourself, because the storm will inevitably end, and you need to make sure you're still standing at the end of it. Here's number 3. We give thanks. Give thanks. You know what we learned very early on? To say thank you when something is given to us, right? Like, that's the thing. Like, that's what we learn. Every single parent throughout history has taught their kids to say thank you. 72% of the words that we use as parents come in the anthem, what do we say, right? 72% probably. What do we say, right? We hand them dinner. What do we say, right? Because we're trying to teach them something. I think that God understood that our kids would underappreciate us, so he built in this system where we can force appreciation. right? I mean, when was the last time your 7-year-old walked up to you and said, hey, Dad, I know you work hard and we couldn't quite afford that toy that I wanted, but thanks for trying, right? Like when was the last time that happened? It doesn't happen, right? So we have to teach our kids. Here's the thing though, anyone can honor and thank God when life is going good. Our kids have no issue thanking us when they get the toy. But do our kids say thank you when they don't get the toy? Do our kids say thank you when maybe the situation is not ideal for them? We know that going to bed at a reasonable hour is going to be beneficial for their life. They're not going to thank me for it, right? We can honor and thank God when life is good, but how often do we stop and appreciate what God is doing in the middle of the mess? Our prayers in the mess become pleas to God. Cries out, asks. We want things in the turmoil. How many times in the mess do we say, thank you? Thank you for bringing me through this. Thank you for having a plan regardless of what I can see. I read this week that 7 out of 10 Americans read the news and get angry every single day about something that they read. 7 out of 10. Stop reading the news. That might be bad advice. I don't know. Do what you want. I thought that I would counter the stats, right? So I went on a hunt for a current positive news story. I didn't want to hear about war. I didn't want to hear about politics. I didn't want to hear negative things. I wanted to counter the stats. So I went looking for a positive article, and I ran across this article about a blind man who is in this Facebook group. And on this Facebook group, the group is all about dogs, and there are thousands of people in it. And he posted on this Facebook page, will somebody please give me a description of your dog? And then thousands of people gave a description of their dog. And I thought, that doesn't make me angry. That makes me incredibly happy, right? And then you see the guy's post and he's just gushing with appreciation for these people who stepped up to simply explain their dog. I would love to describe my dog. My dog has a real zeal for life. I'm not joking. How many times are we begging God for eyesight and we forget that there are so many other things happening around us? That we forget to thank God for this, and this because we're pleading for something over here. A lot of you know I lost the hearing in my right ear. I can't hear on this side of my head. Some of you are new. I promise I've not ignored you. This past week, my kids learned that they can stay up as late as they want if they ask me something from the Bible. They've got this real preacher gonna preach mentality, right? And it's like literally the other night, Shayna was gone. I don't know where she is, painting the town red somewhere, and I'm home parenting, and I'm just joking. I'm joking. So I'm home with the girls though, and they stayed up so late because they're like, Dad, tell us about, and I'm like, oh, here we go, right? And so I start preaching to the kids. And so the other night they asked me about, tell us about the crucifixion. Tell us when Jesus died on the cross. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be good, right? I'm going to get them saved today. And so we started talking about it, and I backed the story up, and we're in the garden. Jesus is praying, and then the guards come, and Peter cuts off the ear of the servant, and Jesus heals his ear. And in the most sincere, innocent way possible, Sailor, my oldest, looks at me and she says, Dad, why doesn't God heal your ear? And tears are running down my face. I'm like, I don't know, right? But see, I stand to believe that God has a plan no matter what we understand. No matter what we recognize at the time. That we choose to thank him for that because God's plan is outside of our ability to understand it. Verse 35 says, then Paul took some bread, gave thanks to God before them all, and broke off a piece and ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat, all 276 of us who were on board. In the midst of the storm, Paul starts thanking God. Paul sits down to a meal and he thanks God. Hey, death is knocking on the door. is thank God. There's something about bringing our best gratitude to God in the middle of a storm that builds our faith and builds our trust and builds our ability to hope in something bigger than what we can see. I don't know what it is. I can only assume it's something supernatural inside of us, that God built it into us from the very beginning. But our appreciation, our gratitude, and our thanks gives us the extra push that we need in the middle of the storm. My coworkers are horrible. God, thank you for giving me people to work with. My marriage is falling apart. God, thank you for giving me the ability to recognize that there are issues happening in my marriage. My kids stopped talking to me. God, thank you for presenting me with the story of the prodigal son. So I'm going to pray through it that my kids come back to me. God, thank you for scripture. Find the lesson in the storm and lean into the fact that God has got this. Here's number 4. Hold on to whatever you have to hold on to. It says, but they hit a shoal and ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship stuck fast while the stern was repeatedly smashed by the forces of the waves and began to break apart. The boat is literally falling apart as it has crashed into the ground and waves are crashing against it. The crew and the passengers, they're all terrified. You've got soldiers on board who are also terrified because they're people, but they also have the responsibility of the prisoners on board. It goes on, it says the soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure that they didn't swim ashore and escape. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out their plan. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump aboard first and make for land. The others held on to planks or debris from the broken ship. So everyone escaped safely to shore. What do you do in the middle of the storm? You hold on. Sometimes you just hold on. Some swam for safety, some grabbed whatever they could find, and they just held on. Find the thing that's going to get you through the storm. Sometimes we can't force the storm to go away. We can't control the storm. We can't stop the storm, but we can grab onto something and hold on for dear life. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. To me, it reads like this: we are hard pressed, but we don't have to be crushed. We're perplexed, but we don't have to be in despair. We are perplexed, but we don't have to be alone. We're struck down, but we don't have to be destroyed. Why? Because my hope is in the one that protects. My hope is in the one that breathes life. My hope is in the one that comforts. My hope is in the one that sustains. I don't have to be destroyed because God is sustaining me. I'm not alone because God is comforting me. I'm not in despair because God is breathing life into me. I'm not perplexed because I have this God who is taking care of me and building things around me even when I'm not aware that he is building things around me. Hope doesn't mean that we fake it. Hope means that we are assured in the safety, in the confidence that Christ is who he says he is and that what he has promised will be fulfilled. Here's the bottom line. I have hope. I have hope because God is with me. We do this thing. We commit to this thing. We walk through the storm. We weather the storm. We stay put. We take care of ourselves. We cling to whatever we have because God is with me. And God's plan is not going to end in turmoil. God's plan is to carry you through the storm. Get through the storm. Come on and pray. Jesus, thank you so much.